Hello, welcome back to English 221, and this is for our class for Monday, the 7th of April, where we are finally ready to discuss Richard II. So, as you know, you have spent several classes watching the BBC production of Richard II, the BBC undertaking this grand plan to put all of Shakespeare's plays as accurately as possible on film in the 1980s. So these are the versions that are the most faithful to the text. As you know, we've been watching different kinds of performances, whether it be a production in Shakespeare's Globe Theatre, or whether it be a Hollywood production, or now what we are viewing as a BBC production. And considering the fact that the history plays are notoriously long and confusing, it seems to make sense that we would watch a production that is as accurate to the text as possible. And I had left you with some questions to consider about Richard II. But before we talk about that, I wanted to let you know that I am in the midst of grading paper number 1. So you should be receiving that via email. And all of you have the option of doing a revision for paper number 1. I just ask that you submit in the original paper with my commentary on it, along with your revision before the last day of class. So ultimately, you've got a good amount of time to do this. And I am working on the papers that were submitted to me by the due date. And then after that, all of those other papers are in what I call the queue, in that I'm working on other classes, but I will be getting to them. And the first paper I see is a kind of learning exercise. So if you're content with your grade, you're fine. But if you wanted to improve your grade, you've got the option of revising. Now, your second paper will be due at the very ending of the semester, and it will be based on either the history play, which is Richard II, or the two tragedies that we are going to be discussing, which happen to be Hamlet and Othello. Now, we will end the semester with a play called The Tempest, which is a tragic comedy that I have put as an extra credit. And that means that there will be a question on the examination to allow you to earn a little bit of extra credit if you so wanted to. And in terms of The Tempest, that is a possibility also for paper, even though we won't be talking about it in the same kind of depth that we've been talking about in terms of the other plays. I also wanted to remind you that registration period is now open, and you'll see in the notes below under the second section, I've included a link where you can access the course schedule for both the summer and the fall semesters. If you've never taken a summer class before, they're highly condensed. We break our summers into 2 sessions. Summer session 1 begins at the ending of the spring semester and goes until about mid-July. Summer session 2 picks up in mid-July, and it goes up until the beginning of the fall semester. So the summer sessions are each approximately 8 weeks long. A typical semester is 16 weeks long, so it's half as long. But you do the same amount of work. So they are highly condensed, but I've found that the classes are smaller and the students tend to be very focused. Most of the summer session classes that we offer are online classes, which makes a certain level of sense, but we do offer a few face-to-face classes as well. And for you, I believe that you've probably satisfied your liberal arts degree requirement by taking English 221 this class, which is what we call a 200 level English class. But if you are a fan of English classes or thinking about becoming an English major and transferring, it is possible to get a degree option at GCC focusing on English. You would take 6 200 level English classes, and this class counts as 1. So basically you would take 5. And the degree is very similar to the liberal arts degree. The difference is in the electives, that most of the electives are devoted to English classes. So it's a great thing to do if you are, again, considering becoming an English major, or just you wanted to be able to show that you've got a facility for writing and reading. I am the program advisor for that, but you could talk to any member of the English department about that if you wanted further information. And it's very easy to go in and out of this degree so that if you change your mind along the way and you decide you just want a liberal arts degree, you can just use the 200 level English classes that you've selected as your general electives. And that was done purposefully. So if you have any questions at all about registration, I will be teaching summer session 1, English 247, which is a Women in Literature 1 class, focusing on literature written by women in the 1800s. I'll also be teaching in the fall semester another 200 level English class, Gothic Literature, English 229, and both of these classes are online classes, much like this one. I teach an array of classes, so I also teach public speaking, which I will be doing in the summer and I believe in the fall as well. And I'm teaching a media and popular culture class during the second summer session, which is basically the class that is the recommended prerequisite, but only recommended for the horror film class that I teach that I've probably mentioned before. And not sure if horror film will be offered in the fall semester, but second summer session, we are definitely offering media and popular culture, which is an introduction to the history of media and how the internet has basically absorbed all of those. And it is possible to take the horror film class first and then media and popular culture, or vice versa. They stand as independent classes. So, in terms of Richard II and the questions I left you with, I wanted to go through some of those questions. The first being, why does Bolingbroke accuse Mowbray of Gloucester's murder? And you probably noted that as you were reviewing the play, all of the members of the royal family are related to one another because basically position is given through birthright. And in terms of the history, there is some questions about whether or not it was Bolingbroke who accused Mowbray, or could it have been Mowbray who accused Bolingbroke? It doesn't necessarily matter because, from a dramatic standpoint, Shakespeare deliberately had Bolingbroke be the one who accused Mowbray of Gloucester's murder. So it could just be that Bolingbroke is concerned with justice and he wants a traitor to pay the penalty. Or it could be that ultimately Bolingbroke is hopeful that if he plays his cards right, whether or not Mowbray is guilty of treason, perhaps Bolingbroke can set a series of events in place so that Bolingbroke can take over Richard II's position. I had suggested that you might want to think about this play in terms of Washington, D.C., with all of the political machinations that go on in Washington, D.C. And what the public knows is only one piece of what's happening. There's a lot that's going on behind closed doors that we will never know for certain. So much of this is going to be dependent on how the actors and the director decide to play the characters. And in the BBC production, we definitely see Richard II as being played very foppishly, which is how he would have been characterized during his historical period, but also a very, very poor ruler, which is part of what Richard II is making commentary about. Who has the right to rule? Should it be based on birthright? And if not, should it be based on ability? Richard II has a closer birthright. He doesn't necessarily have ability. Mowbray's birthright is, or I should say, Bolingbroke's birthright is much farther than Richard's, but perhaps he has a greater ability to rule. We could never know for certain. This question would be central for Renaissance audiences as Queen Elizabeth was nearing the ending of her long reign with no direct heirs in sight. So the question of who would succeed Queen Elizabeth was on everyone's minds, but it was something that you didn't really talk about publicly. As I've mentioned before, it was a pretty open period, the Renaissance, for discussions of things like sex and violence, but not necessarily politics. Saying the wrong thing politically could get you killed. That's not to say that Shakespeare wasn't political. He just couched his political arguments cleverly. And one of the things he did, especially in Richard II, is by revisiting England's past history about rulership, because there really was a Richard II who was a boy king, who had his uncles basically rule the kingdom for him until he became of age. And ultimately, that meant that Richard never really developed any leadership skills, and he was a poor ruler who was ultimately replaced by Bolingbroke. Those are the broad strokes of the history. And this play gives us a dramatic representation of some of the machinations that might have occurred to have that happen. And audiences, of course, who were watching carefully would note the parallels with Queen Elizabeth herself. Not necessarily that there was somebody who was trying to take over her throne, but the question of who should rule after her death. And again, there were lots of distant family members who were jockeying for position. So, should it be the one that's considered to be the closest in terms of bloodlines, or should it be the one who shows perhaps a superior capability to rule? So, in the end, we know that Mowbray denies that he's Gloucester's murderer. Perhaps he's innocent. Perhaps he's guilty and he's trying to hide the fact that he's guilty. Now, why does Richard want Bolingbroke and Mowbray to settle their dispute? Perhaps this is just a distraction for Richard because he wants to govern and think about other things. Or perhaps somehow Richard is guilty himself of Gloucester's murder and he would like all of this to go away. And then ultimately, since the dispute can't be settled, Richard decides on a public battle. And that could be a mark of good rulership by having witnesses in place and having the better man win, so to speak. It could be an example of poor leadership by not making a decision and hoping that one or perhaps both men will be killed in battle, so that this entire problem goes away. And then, which is highly suspicious, Richard decides to cancel the public battle and gives two punishments. Now, this could be because Richard wants to show mercy, or it could be because Richard is trying to manipulate his public image, or it could be that Richard is a poor, indecisive ruler. Maybe several are possible at the same time. Richard gives Mowbray life punishment, and Bolingbroke only a 10-year punishment, which then is reduced to 6. This is highly suspicious. Now, obviously, Bolingbroke, being a closer family relation, is perhaps of concern to Richard, but what could be a bigger concern to Richard is that he and Mowbray worked together to murder Gloucester, and he has something to hide, and he wants Mowbray to be quiet, especially because Richard, makes it very clear that he doesn't want Mowbray and Bolingbroke having any kind of conversation with one another. Reducing Bolingbroke's sentence, was this a way to impress Gaunt, Bolingbroke's father, by showing mercy? Or was this a way to curry public favor by showing that he's a merciful ruler? Or is this just an issue of Richard being indecisive and a poor leader? Gaunt, Bolingbroke's father, and his name is so symbolic because England itself has become gaunt and is dying because of Richard's poor leadership. Gaunt on his deathbed warns Richard against poor rule. And I guess if you're ever going to confront a ruler about their poor rule, the time you would do it is on your deathbed. Keep in mind that the ruler was seen as next to God Almighty. The king would be the God anointed on earth. So confronting Richard about his poor rule would be comparable to confronting God, even on your deathbed. So this shows a certain level of bravery from Gaunt. Richard's response after Gaunt dies is that he seizes Bolingbroke's inheritance and uses the money in his Irish wars. We aren't given a really good political reason as to why there are Irish wars. It seems that Richard wants to play warrior more than anything else, especially in the BBC production that we saw. So this is an obvious abuse of power. And That said, we see the beginning of Richard's descent and the beginning of Bolingbroke's ascent. Richard leaves for these Irish wars, which, again, is not very smart for a leader to leave their country when they're in turmoil, and entrusts York with the kingdom. Now, York is a trusted advisor and also one of Richard's uncles, but it might not be the smartest move, again, to entrust anybody with the kingdom. This shows how invincible Richard believes he is, how arrogant Richard believes he is, and how wrong Richard is when it comes to this. Because ultimately, Bolingbroke will break his exile, and he comes with an army, and he says to get an inheritance. But one has to question, why would he come with an army? Well, perhaps because he knows that he's breaking exile, so he's trying to protect himself. Or perhaps because he knows that the threat of having an army behind him is going to mean that Richard needs to do more than just give Bolingbroke the inheritance, but give Bolingbroke the kingdom. So all of this could have been a power play that was masterfully, much like a chess match, played by Bolingbroke. Now, York at this point vows to remain neutral. This is major because ultimately York knows that Richard has been abusing his position, but York also knows that Richard is God anointed. So rather than take a position, York, at least at this point, says he's going to remain neutral. Richard ultimately relinquishes his throne to Bolingbroke, and it could be because Richard is basically a timid leader and he doesn't fight. Or it could be that Richard is well aware that Bolingbroke has an army behind him and he can't win. This is where you see some of Richard's most self-pitying speeches. Next class, we're going to talk about some of the quotations in Richard II that are so pivotal. The play is known for incredibly beautiful poetry. And notice how these characters are speaking poetry, which is what is expected of the royal family. Now, ultimately, we see, and this is the only really light scene in the play. Notice the filming of the BBC version we saw where everything is so dark and shadowy. The gardener scene, as it's known, where the gardeners are outside, it's bright and sunny, and we see plants, and they're discussing the country's state of affairs, and the queen overhears them. Now, a lot is going on in this particular scene. The idea that you learn information through eavesdropping, we saw something like that in Much Ado About Nothing. The fact that the queen is so removed from the political scene and she's not involved in political affairs, which says a great deal about the patriarchal society of the time period. Note this when we move to our tragedy, or our first tragedy, which happens to be Macbeth, where Lady Macbeth is his dear partner in greatness, and she is not excluded from political affairs. In fact, some might say that she's the one who's running political affairs, but that's certainly not the expected, and that's certainly not what we see with Richard II. And the fact that the gardeners, of all people, understand that you need to weed a garden, much like you need to weed out the corruption in society, illustrates a common theme in Shakespeare where it's the lower level characters who oftentimes have great insight. Now, York ultimately switches his allegiance to Bolingbroke. This is huge. York has decided that he's going to defy the convention of supporting the God anointed and follow Bolingbroke, who seems to have a better ability to lead. Now, Bolingbroke executes Bushy and Green. Now, Bushy and Green were working with Richard as traitors, so it could be that Bolingbroke is trying to, so to speak, rid the society, the kingdom of those weeds that are corrupting the land. Or it could be that Bolingbroke is afraid that if Bushy and Green are left alive, that they could work and gather a faction to try to overthrow Bolingbroke, because there's still a good number of people who are supporting Richard because he is the God anointed. Merrill, this happens to be one of Bolingbroke's cousins, plans to overthrow Bolingbroke. And this shows how family member is pitted against family member in the question of who has the right to rule. Should it be the God anointed, or should it be the individual who seems to have better capabilities? Note that this is not something that is followed by York, who ultimately is, or I'm sorry, ultimately is going to support Bolingbroke as opposed to Omer, who is going to try to overthrow Bolingbroke. Again, showing how family member is pitted against family member. So Omer plans to overthrow Bolingbroke, but it turns out that his mother intervenes. This is the only example we have of a strong female character who ultimately is going to speak on Omer's, her son's behalf, and get mercy from Bolingbroke. And Bolingbroke pardons Omer. Why? Is it because Bolingbroke is a merciful ruler? Or is it because Bolingbroke wants Omer and his mother to be indebted to him so that ultimately he can call in on this debt at another political time? Richard is ultimately jailed and then killed by someone who overheard Bolingbroke, who was musing, wouldn't it be nice, if you will use that term, if Richard was no longer with us? Now, this could have just been a statement that was completely innocent, or this could be a very deliberate statement that Bolingbroke was quite aware would be taken by one of his subjects as a call to action. And then Bolingbroke could say he's completely innocent because he never bloodied his hands. He was just merely musing. So Richard is ultimately jailed. And again, you might wonder why it is that Bolingbroke doesn't kill Richard, but that could make Richard into a martyr. And that wouldn't be very good for Bolingbroke, let's say. Or it could be that, again, Bolingbroke is showing mercy to Richard by allowing him to live and not executing him. So, again, I think the parallels with any kind of modern day political world are that there are more questions than answers. And ultimately, the play ends with Bolingbroke vowing to go on a holy pilgrimage. Whether or not it's because Bolingbroke understands that he's not the God anointed, so therefore he has to, in one way or another, appease God. Or is it that Bolingbroke wants to go on a holy pilgrimage so that he can make his image appear to be much more religious than what it is? Or is it that ultimately Bolingbroke is well aware that rocky times are ahead? Just because Richard has been executed, that doesn't mean that Richard doesn't have his followers. And these plays continue. We stop with the history play, the first of Richard II, but it continues on with Bolingbroke's story, who is now King Henry. Henry IV, Part 1, and his story is so long it goes to Henry IV, Part 2, and then ends with Henry V. So there are four pieces in this initial history known as the Chronicle plays because they basically tell a chronicle of British history. So you could continue to read on to find out what occurs, but ultimately I was hoping that Richard II, and note that we tend to condense the title. We call it Richard II, but the title in its entirety is The Tragedy of Richard II. Will give you an idea of the shift from what we've done with comedies and what we expect with comedies and what we will be expecting not only with history plays, because we know that they have to be based, although sometimes loosely, on British history, but the tragedies are very similar to what we see in the tragedy of Richard II, because Richard II is very much a tragic hero. So this is in the fourth section in the notes below. If you know anything about the history of drama, then you know about Greek drama and Oedipus the King, which was written in 430 BC. That particular play is usually used as the gold standard for establishing what tragedy and the tragic tradition should be. A set of rules that Shakespeare and his predecessors would follow, but Shakespeare would take liberties, as was often the case with Shakespeare, not because he didn't know the rules, but because he wanted to do so for dramatic purposes. So Oedipus the King if you don't know, the play happens to be about a king named Oedipus, and the play starts in what's called media res in the middle. And the community in Athens is being ravaged by plague. Now, keep in mind, in 430 BC, this is a society of gods in the plural. So Oedipus, as a good king, makes a resolution to try to determine how the gods have been offended so that they can stop the ravaging of the plague. The assumption is that the plague is a response from the gods who've been offended. And Oedipus sends out multiple advisors, including his own brother-in-law, to consult with oracles and prophets to determine the cause of the plague. And they all come back with the same answer, that Oedipus himself is responsible. And Oedipus is horrified by the whole thing and is in denial and disbelief. And then we get backstory, which verifies that Oedipus himself was indeed responsible. And the backstory goes all the way back to Oedipus's birth parents, who, when they had Oedipus as a baby, visited an oracle, which was quite common at the time. And the oracle told them that their baby would eventually grow up to kill his father, marry his mother. And Oedipus's birth parents are so horrified by this that they decide to give the baby to one of their servants so the baby will be killed. But the servant takes pity on the baby and abandons the baby, and the baby is found by the servant of another kingdom and brought to that other kingdom. And the king and queen of that kingdom, who don't have children of their own, raise that baby as their own and never tell that baby that he is adopted. That baby grows up to be Oedipus, the man, who consults an oracle when he's a man, and he's told that one day he will kill his father and marry his mother. And Oedipus is so horrified by this that he decides that he needs to leave his mother and father, his kingdom, immediately and go far away as possible to protect them. Again, he doesn't know that these are his adopted parents, not his biological parents. And it turns out in Oedipus's travels at a crossroad, which has symbolic significance as well as literal significance, it turns out that Oedipus's chariot is blocked, and in what one of my former students called perhaps one of the earliest instances of literary road rage, Oedipus ends up slaying everybody in the chariot, and one of those people happened to be, well, Oedipus's birth father. And then Oedipus comes across a community that's ravaged by plague. In this instance, the plague is because of a monster called the Sphinx. And the Sphinx has a riddle that needs to be solved before the Sphinx can be defeated and the actual plague be eliminated. There's a long literary tradition of riddles needing to be solved to defeat monsters. The riddle, by the way, happened to be what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, 3 in the evening. The answer is man. 4 legs in the morning is crawling. 2 legs in the afternoon is an adult. Afternoon representing adulthood, morning representing childhood. And then the evening, which represents old age, 3 legs, which happens to be walking with a cane. Oedipus is the only one who's able to solve this riddle, illustrating his great intelligence. And as a result, Oedipus is rewarded with the kingdom because it turns out their king has recently been killed. And that means that Oedipus also gets the newly widowed queen. So Oedipus marries her and they have children. And yes, it turns out that this is Oedipus's birth mother. And when ultimately all of this is revealed, both Oedipus and his wife/mother are horrified. His wife/mother commits suicide, unable to face the truth. Oedipus ends up gouging out his eyes with his brooches because he's been blind to the truth the entire time. In fact, Oedipus even consulted with a prophet who was physically blind, but had great insight. So now Oedipus is physically blind at the ending of the play, but has insight about the truth of his birth and how he truly was responsible for the plague. And then Oedipus is exiled. And that's the beginning of Oedipus's story because it is a trilogy, a 3-part play. So the second play is about Oedipus's children who are now adults. And the third play happens to be about Oedipus again, now as an old man, and has he appeased the gods. And I mention all of this because this play has helped to determine what a tragic hero is, which is going to be important for Richard II. That a tragic hero should be a great man above and beyond the ordinary. So Oedipus the king is a great man above the and beyond the ordinary because ultimately he's a king, so he has a high position, and he also has great intelligence. He was able to solve the riddle of the Sphinx. And this great individual experiences a downfall, hence the tragedy. And the downfall happens for two reasons. One is because of outside forces. And in Oedipus the king, that's called fate. And was Oedipus fated to this? And were Oedipus's parents fated to this tragedy? And if so, did that mean they didn't have free will? And also, despite the fact that fate plays a role, there also are tragic flaws in characters, mistakes, errors, sins that the tragic hero commits that leads to their downfall. And we can see quite a few of them with Oedipus. His excessive temper when he slays everybody at the crossroads, his denial and thinking that he himself can be responsible for the plague, and most importantly, his desire to outwit the gods, that when he's given this terrible prophecy, instead of humbly accepting it, he tries to change his fate. And by trying to change his fate, he actually brings it about. And his parents do the same. Now, it's difficult to understand that from a 2025 perspective, but this would have been the way the world would have been viewed in 430 BC. That Oedipus's major flaw would be his hubris, his arrogance that leads to his descent. The question being, if he had just not done anything and had humbly accepted his fate, would any of it occur? And this question goes all the way back to Oedipus's birth parents. And this great man accepts responsibility. And the way that we see Oedipus accepting responsibility is not by committing suicide, the way his wife slash mother does, which would be seen as basically taking the easy way out. But instead, he lives with the consequences of his actions. He gouges out his eyes, which is thematically and symbolically important because his eyes have betrayed him. The whole play is about vision and blindness. And he basically is going to live a life in exile and pain and suffering. So that would be accepting responsibility. And again, this is the model for what a tragic hero should be, with authors sometimes playing around with the definition of tragic hero, Shakespeare being one of them, not because they don't know the elements associated with tragic hero, but because they wanted, for their dramatic purposes, to see how they could create a story that perhaps has even more complexity than Oedipus the King, because after all, Oedipus the King was in the very early days of drama where characters were pretty one-dimensional, and oftentimes the plays themselves were rather one-dimensional. So today's attendance question, which is going to be a question that we will revisit when we move into the tragedies, but since we're reading a history, Richard II, that also has tragic elements, hence the title, The Tragedy of Richard II, the question seems to be appropriate. Do you think that Richard II can be considered a tragic hero based on the definition that I've given you about tragic hero? And why or why not? And as we move to plays like Macbeth and Othello, it'll be even clearer that these are individuals who represent the tragic tradition, but with Shakespeare making some changes. So this will be due on Wednesday the 9th, and as you've probably seen, I've fallen a little bit behind in responding to the attendance questions because I'm working on papers, but I will be catching up with that shortly. So again, by Wednesday the 9th, and if you need additional time, please just ask for an extension. As you know, you're not required to respond to your classmates, though you're certainly encouraged to, but you are required to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. Do you think Richard II can be considered as a tragic hero, and why or why not? Next class, we'll finish up Richard II by talking about some quotations. And ultimately, then we will move to talking about tragedies. That the history plays, yes, are similar to the tragedies, but the history plays are based on English history. That's not going to be the case with the tragedies that we are reading. and the history plays are going to be firmly embedded in the political realm, and that does not necessarily have to be the case with the tragedies that we're reading. And of course, we know that the history plays are dark, the tragedies will be much darker with a lot more depth to them. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class, moving from Richard II to Macbeth and our tragedy section. Take care. Bye-bye.